Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Welcome to the City Club. My name is Tom Lucchesi, and I'm a partner at the law firm of BakerHostetler. And on behalf of my firm and its partners and its employees, we are happy to be sponsoring today the 2020 High School Debate Championship. We're going to see today two championship debaters. We have Allie Dettelbach from Hawken School and Peyrat from University School that are debating for the championship for the North Coast District of the National Speech and Debate Association. On behalf of BakerHostetler, we are proud to sponsor this event in memory of our late partner, Patrick Jordan. This is an unusual day and maybe a first in the history of the City Club. Normally, this debate is held before 200 to 220, I was going to say 220,000 people, not quite that many, 200 to 220 people packed into the room. Because of the coronavirus and the limitations on public gatherings and public health and safety concerns, this debate is being held in front of about 40 friends and associates of the debaters and a few members of the City Club. But I know there's a lot of people out on live stream that are watching this, including your fellow debaters from your schools that you've been competing against all year, and I know they're rooting for you. And especially, I want to say hello, not just to them, but to Pat's wife, Sharon Sobel Jordan. And hopefully Sharon's out there. Sharon, if you're out there, send me a text. But Sharon couldn't be here today. This is the first debate in 26 years that she's missed. Our law firm has been sponsoring this in memory of Pat for 26 years. He died in 1995. Pat, I wanted to say a few words about Pat, because the purpose of sponsoring this, in addition to supporting the students, was to keep Pat's memory alive. Pat was a championship debater. Pat was a big Irishman, a big, bald Irishman who was larger than life. I worked with Pat. I had the privilege of working with him a lot before he died. He was left-handed. And when he would debate, he would sweep that left arm around, which was symbolic. It gave him space, because he was a big guy. It gave him space, and it also told you your arguments were worthless in the face of his better reasoned and more forcefully directed arguments. And this was, for the kids that are listening, this is before the internet. So our debates were lively and spirited, and we were not constrained by the facts, because you could not go to the internet and check on anything. And we would debate everything. And Pat loved to argue, and he was a championship arguer. But I want to tell one short story about Pat. I call it the story of Joe. And this, to me, embodies Pat's memory. Pat was a lawyer at Baker. It was the 1980s, where Key Tower is now, off of Public Square, hadn't been built yet. My law firm represented the owners of the developers of Key Tower, and Pat's job was to go negotiate with the people that owned land that were going to be taken over for the construction of Key Tower. And Pat had one very intense negotiation, which is a debate. One intense negotiation with a restaurant owner named Joe. Joe wanted money for his restaurant. Pat, on behalf of the developer, wanted to pay less. Joe wanted more. And they had intense debate, intense argument about the value of that restaurant, back and forth, heated exchanges over a course of many, many months. At the end of the day, they reached an agreement. They shook hands, and they were friends for the next decade until Pat died. To this day, 30 years later, I see Joe. He has another restaurant here in Cleveland. He remembers Pat, and he remembers Pat favorably, despite their difference of opinion, which they were able to resolve after debate about the merits of their respective positions. And that's a quality that Pat had. You could hate him in the moment, but in the long run, you loved him because he was honest, he was forthright, he told you what was on his mind, and he debated in a logical sense. And that's something that you should cherish, and I hope your generation is able to bring back to this country because we've lost that. That's a terrible thing that we've lost. We've lost the ability to talk to each other and debate issues. So in a minute, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Peyrat Zeynalov. Did I get that right? Close enough. Close. With a name like Lucchesi, I know what it's like to have a difficult name. But he is going to explain the Lincoln Douglas style of debate, which you're going to be seeing on display here. So in memory of Pat and in honor of these two excellent debaters, let's get off to a good start and welcome everybody, and here we go.
On behalf of the debaters, coaches, and judges here today, as well as the Cleveland debate community at large, I would like to offer our sincerest thanks to the City Club for its continual support of high school forensics over the years. For over 30 years, the City Club has been generous enough to host the season finals in Lincoln Douglas debate. I know I speak for everyone in the debate community when I express our immense gratitude to BakerHostetler, which has sponsored the championship for over 20 years in memory of partner Patrick J. Jordan, a highly respected trial lawyer at the firm who died in 1995. Thank you so much for everyone at BakerHostetler for giving debate this moment in the spotlight. It is an activity that has touched the lives of thousands of Cleveland area teens over the years and hopefully will inspire countless more over the years to come. Today's debate has a panel of 3 judges: Daniel Doza, a staff attorney at Nueva Luz Urban Resource Center, Mark McCandless, the head coach at Brecksville Broadview Heights High School, and Vicky Balzar, who continues to actively serve debate community after retiring from coaching at Mid-Park and Magnificent High Schools. The 2 debaters sitting in front of you on stage today are both incredibly talented and have worked very hard to get here. On my right, Dev Peyrat, a sophomore from University School, coached by Mr. Peter Paik and James Lewis. And Allie Dettelbach on my left, a junior from Hawken, coached by Mr. Bob Schertz. Both Allie and Dev, along with Nehal Sugarapati and William Liu, qualified for the national tournament in June. This is a Lincoln Douglas debate, which means that competitors must evaluate current political and social issues through a value-based lens. Resolutions in LD look beyond simply the benefits or effectiveness of policies and mandates, but at their fundamental morality or justice. Each debater will present a value, which they claim is the ultimate good to be achieved in the context of the round, a value criterion, a way of clearly measuring who best achieves the value, and a constructive, who best explains how their side best meets the burden of the value criterion. Each debater has a chance to cross-examine the other after the case is initially presented. They also will have opportunities to rebut their opponent's points. Both sides have an equal amount of speaking, cross-examining, and preparation time, but the affirmative has the advantage of speaking first and last, while the negatives comes from longer speeches. The resolution for today's debate will be resolved: predictive policing is unjust. Congratulations to both debaters on reaching this round today, and let the debate begin.
Judges, are all of you ready? Allie?
Yeah.
All right. With that, I'll begin. I affirm the resolution resolved: predictive policing is unjust. Thus, my value, the ultimate imperative of today's round, is justice, defined as giving each their due, as all people have intrinsic worth that we ought to respect. The best value criterion or standard to achieve justice is reducing structural oppression, defined as the tendency of institutions to promote hierarchies disproportionately harming certain peoples. You prefer this value criterion because when a group of people are disenfranchised, power disparities occur, and those with power are left to abuse those without it unimpeded. Those without power cannot pursue goals or ends, and ultimately, their value as humans and the dues that they ought to be given are not respected. Thus, the impacts of public policies ought to be distributed evenly. My first contention is that predictive policing is discriminatory. There are 4 ways in which predictive policing harms minority communities. First, through bias from analysts. Eric Backey of NYU explains in 2014 that the predictive power of algorithms hinges on both the analyst's role in designing the model and the data input. Analysts take an active role in data mining. This allows analysts to influence which variables algorithms take into account and ingrain their positive and normative decisions into future predictions. The second way is implicit police biases. Predictive algorithms rely on data recorded by law enforcement, and as Rashida Richardson of NYU writes in 2019, predictive algorithms are built on data produced during periods of flawed, racially biased, and unlawful practices and policies. If predictive policing systems are informed by such data, they cannot escape the legacies of the unlawful or biased policing practices that they are built on. Thus, previous policing biases just remanifest themselves in predictive algorithms, and minority communities are only further stigmatized, creating a feedback loop of discrimination. The third way is active police biases. Matthew Valisic of LSU explains in 2018 that knowing that they are in a prediction area may heighten the awareness of police officers in ways that amplify biases. A minority individual observed in a prediction area may be more likely to be subject to biased police actions than the same individual observed outside of a prediction area. The fourth way is hampering reintegration. As William Wong of Middlesex University explains in 2015, the use of predictive policing could lead to a stigmatization of former criminals who have served their sentence, and could therefore undermine their resocialization and reintegration into society. The attention of the police in handling cases of individuals with criminal history might trigger some risk of reoffense. In these four ways, predictive policing has perpetuated biases, which has been proved empirically. Dr. Christian Lum writes in 2016, when predictive policing has been implemented, areas with largely non-white and low-income populations experience about 200 times more drug arrests than areas outside of these clusters. In contrast, estimates suggest that drug crimes are much more evenly distributed. Ultimately then, predictive policing unfairly discriminates against minority communities and perpetuates structural oppression. My second contention is that predictive policing lacks accountability. Predictive policing algorithms have also evaded democratic checks. This occurs for two reasons. First, they're developed by private corporations. Andrew Ferguson of Washington University explains in 2017 that predictive policing algorithms are built in the private sector, and thus are proprietary technologies belonging to corporations. This means that predictive policing algorithms have managed to avoid oversight of any sort. Second, because these algorithms are too complex. Ferguson furthers, explaining that the complexity of the algorithms makes it nearly impossible for third parties to check the algorithm for flaws. This is further compounded by machine learning algorithms used by predictive policing technology. According to Scanlon of Brigham Young University in 2019, once these algorithms begin learning, it becomes impossible for even the original programmers to understand the changes made to the processes behind the algorithms. This lack of accountability manifests itself in an accountability gap. Mayer 19 explains that since law enforcers cannot fully understand and interpret the outcomes of the software and deem the outcomes as sufficient input for decision making, officers cannot deduce biases in the model, and it becomes unclear who is responsible for decision making. This allows officers to avoid culpability or checks on their behavior. Additionally, this accountability gap also stops real reform in law enforcement. Backy 14 explains that the appearance of a neutral mechanism knocks the wind out of the sails of social justice movements working to redress these wrongs. Police departments can respond to such movements by claiming they have already instituted the desired change, even while that change proves hollow. So ultimately, a lack of accountability and an accountability gap ensure that discrimination against minority communities persists. Further, that absence of oversight makes predictive policing an illegitimate use of power by the state, as it's instituted through an exclusionary process. Policies that are implemented in such a way ignore the interest of minorities and perpetuate power disparities. Thus, even if predictive policing produces positive benefits for communities, it's inherently unjust. My third and final contention is that predictive policing makes policing more difficult for police officers. There are two ways in which the effectiveness of law enforcement is reduced by predictive technologies. First, complex algorithms. According to Mayer 19, if law enforcers do not understand the factors that lead to an increased chance of crime, the effectiveness of their actions might be reduced. Predictions that are derived on algorithms are opaque and hard to interpret. Second, by citizen distrust. When predictive algorithms rely on data reported by citizens rather than by police, they fail to produce benefit. Shapiro 17 explains that foreign-born citizens and non-US citizens are less likely to report crimes that are US-born citizens. Neighborhoods that have large immigrant populations may thus be excluded by the algorithm. Ferguson 17 furthers, writing that crimes like sexual assault, domestic violence, and fraud tend to be underreported. Some communities, frustrated with current policing practices, simply decline to report crimes. Half of all crimes with victims go unreported. Empirically, both of these warrants have been proven. Saunders of the Rand Corporation explains in 2016 that predictive models have identified less than 1% of homicide victims. Ultimately then, we ought to affirm, as we ought not subject minority populations to policing practices that fail to protect them. With that, I affirm and stand ready for cross-examination.
Okay, as soon as everyone's ready for cross-ex? Okay, then let's begin. So let's talk about the notion of structural oppression.
Sure.
Would you agree that, for instance, if you are being abused and the government is not doing anything about it, you would be structurally oppressed?
Well, be more specific than that. Like, how do you mean?
Sure. Like if you're being physically abused or sexually abused, for instance, you would be oppressed.
Right, like I think the government's obligated to try and stop that from happening.
Right. So we can agree that that's going to have a big impact under a framework like yours, correct?
Sure.
Okay.
But
then let's
I
talk
think
about
what's more important is that we stop the government from perpetuating things that do things like that.
Sure. Let's talk about the contention one about discrimination. Can you give me an estimate of about how many police officers you think there are in a country like the U.S.?
I really don't know, Allie.
Okay, but probably more than like 10, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can say that for instance, the more people there are, that would increase the amount of biases there are, just because each individual has biases, correct?
Sure.
Okay, so let's be clear. In a world without predictive policing, we would agree that there is...
Okay, well, hold on. This resolution is specifically asking us if predictive policing specifically is unjust. It's not
Sure.
asking us whether or not we ought to eliminate predictive policing, but whether or
Sure,
not it in
sure,
itself
I
is
understand that,
unjust.
but we're discussing this as a tool. So let's talk about the tool of predictive policing, right? Would you agree that predictive policing adds, for instance, a scientific or analytical element to the policing process?
Sure, but I've shown you in this contention that that's been bad.
Okay, wait. So if predictive policing has been bad in some instances, right?
No, this
Does
is not some instances. This is every instance.
Okay, but that still doesn't answer my question. If something is bad in some instances, or even many instances, or even most instances, does
All
that mean that it
instances.
can never be good?
Yes, I've given you all instances. All 4 of my warrants in my first
Right,
contention
but I
are
mean,
inherent to predictive
sure.
policing.
But what I'm asking you today is okay, would you agree that we're discussing the tool of predictive policing and whether that tool is intrinsically unjust?
Yes.
Okay, so then let's talk about that. Is it true that if something has been unjust in many or even most or even all scenarios, does that mean that it can never have the potential to be just?
Okay, I think, again, this resolution is asking us, is predictive policing unjust? Not whether it
Right.
will be, whether it is unjust.
Wait a minute. Let's talk about the word just. Is just would you say that the word just implies a timeless evaluation, a value judgment about whether or not a tool is intrinsically unjust in and of itself?
I'm sorry, what?
The word unjust, does that imply we're making a value judgment about whether something in itself is always going to be that unjust?
I think the wording of the resolution is implying that predictive policing, as it is, whether or not that's unjust.
Okay.
That's what it's asking
Why
us.
can't we have, for instance, measures that would require a private company to publish their algorithm?
Okay, those don't exist, first of all. And
Right,
second
but
of all,
that's
you
not what I
can't
asked
guarantee
you.
that
That's
they
not
will
what I
exist.
asked you. What I asked you is why is it intrinsic to predictive policing that we have private and secret algorithms?
Okay, even if you prove that somehow these algorithms will be released to the public, you can't prove that those algorithms will still be transparent because they'll
Okay.
be so opaque.
Okay.
This is the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. You're listening to this on 90.3 WCPN. Good afternoon. I'm Nick Castele. I'm a reporter with IdeaStream. I'm joined here by William Liu, a freshman at Brecksville Broadview Heights High School. We are listening to Allie Dettelbach of Hawken and Dev Peyrat of University School debate the resolution, Predictive Policing is Unjust. William, I want to take a second here and back up and ask you to explain for us, what is it that we're listening to right now? What exactly is Lincoln-Douglas debate, and what are our debaters trying to do today?
Okay, so basically the debaters are trying to prove whether or not predictive policing is unjust through statistics or through logical arguments.
And so I know that one phrase we've heard our debaters use is value criterion. Can you explain what that means to the average person?
Okay, so basically value criterion is trying to achieve the value that they're trying to uphold. For example, justice. So they would have a specific way to achieve that value of justice.
So we've heard Dev deliver the affirmative argument. Allie has cross-examined him. How exactly does a debater end up winning a debate? What are you trying to accomplish in the end?
Well, essentially you're trying to win on the arguments and show that you have better arguments with statistics, or just show that you have better logical reasoning.
So are you trying to convince the judges here that you are correct, that you have made the right argument, or just that you've made the best argument?
Basically, that you've made the best argument, as it's more of an objective debate than subjective.
So you don't need to convince judges, for instance, that to believe what you're arguing. You don't need them to walk away saying, yes, I believe that the winner of this debate was right about this issue.
No, I don't think you necessarily need to do that. You just have to prove that you were the best debater in that situation.
Well, how do you do that? So how do you make the best argument?
Well, you just want to prove that essentially your opponent did not find like certain flaws in your argument, and that you found certain flaws in theirs.
And we'll keep watching for those issues as we return to the debate.
So just for a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to begin by reading my constructive, and then I'll respond to Dev's case. Is everybody ready? Okay, I'll begin. I negate, and I have the same framework as my opponent. However, I offer one observation. In order for my opponent to prove that predictive policing is unjust, they must show that its intrinsic characteristics, rather than the ways in which it is applied, are fundamentally unjust. For instance, a knife can be used to stab someone, but it can also be used to cut bread. So we would not call a knife unjust. Contention 1 is helping victims of domestic violence. Predictive policing algorithms can be used by police officers to predict which households are likely to fall into severe domestic violence and by helping the victims to seek safety. Price finds in 2013 that the district attorney's office developed an assessment which acted as an algorithm. Several risk factors are associated with an increased risk of homicides of people in violent relationships. Officers were able to automatically trigger certain protocols based on risk factors, including a call or referral to the domestic violence shelter hotline. The officers involved may immediately call a domestic violence counselor or take other positive steps to protect the victim. Predictive policing is vital because, devastatingly, possessing just one of the risk factors in the algorithm made women 20 times more likely to be murdered. Fortunately, Price concludes that nearly a third of the victims who speak to a counselor because of this program eventually seek a protective order, shelter, or other protective services. Thus, predictive policing is the best way to aid victims in imminent danger. This is important because victims of domestic abuse are some of the most structurally oppressed individuals, so we must prioritize their dues first in order to be just. Contention 2 is protecting the vulnerable from predators. Predictive policing is a vital tool against predators. According to Kim Rosmo, rapists, among other serious offenders, share behavioral characteristics that are innate to all hunters. The concept of using geospatial and other tactical information to construct behavioral patterns has been tested with evidence used to convict criminals. So predictive policing can assist the police by leveraging the larger quantity of psychological information about the people who commit high-volume crimes and use it to predict their actions. The impact of predicting predators' patterns are staggering. McKinney 18 found predictive analytics help sheriff's offices to be able to better identify and monitor high-risk offenders since it began using the system. In Vancouver, for instance, a predator followed girls on their way home from school and sexually assaulted them in wooded areas. With traditional policing, a joint task force of more than 100 officers assembled, but the months-long investigation failed. Meanwhile, the predator struck again. Then they switched over to predictive policing. Conducting advanced geospatial analysis of the attacks, the task force pinpointed a single suspect. Empirically, for rapists, predictive policing has an accuracy of 88%. Thus, predictive policing helps victims of predators, who are some of the most vulnerable members of our society and the most structurally oppressed. So to prioritize the least well-off, and because predictive policing cannot be generally unjust if it helps these people, I negate. Now onto my opponent's case. So the winner of this round is going to be the person who best minimizes structural oppression. But realize that in this round, even if my opponent is proving that even in the majority of cases, the knife is being used to stab people, that doesn't mean it can't be used to cut a sandwich. And that's what this round is about. This round is about proving that predictive policing can be a vital tool that's used to help these people. So with that, let's go to the contention 1 of discrimination. The first reason he gives for this is analyst bias. But the main response here comes from UCLA in 2018, where they did a meta-study of predictive policing, and they found that actually, when in areas that use predictive policing, there weren't more instances of racial profiling. What this proves is that even if there's an analyst bias, when it actually becomes implemented, the racism does not increase from the already racist criminal justice system that we have. But let's go to the second and third reasons he gives for this. He talks about implicit police bias and active police biases. And there are a few responses here. First, on the whole idea, realize that these police officers are still bound by rules like probable cause. These people will still have a trial. So even if there's some sort of semblance of racism, we still have the rest of the criminal justice system to kick in. But the second response is that you can look to Ensign in 2017, who explains that right now, many community systems are using black box methods in order to make sure the system becomes less racist and less biased. That's why Lindsay in 2018 corroborates that there are systems right now who have edited their algorithms to make them less racist and to make the implementation of them less racist. But let's go to why you actually vote for me off of this very issue. which comes from Chan in 2016, who explains that every single time an algorithm is going to be better than human discretion. What we have to look at is that what predictive policing does is it creates a far less bias. This is for two reasons. First, there are more police officers than there are algorithms. What that means is that a world where we don't have predictive policing, or a world where we say it's unjust, is a world where we say it is better to have 40,000 different police officers with their own independent biases making their own judgments. This is bad simply on an issue of having more biases. But the second reason why predictive policing actually improves the situation is because it's far easier to reprogram an algorithm than to reprogram people. That's why Lindsay in 2018 actually concludes that what we've done with predictive policing is we've reanalyzed the system and made sure the analytics we put into it are actually less biased. That's why predictive policing is a crucial tool in minimizing structural oppression. Then on the fourth issue, he talks about reintegration. A couple things here. First, look to Mayer in 2019, which says that predictive policing minimizes crime. This is because if we put more police officers in more high crime areas, we are actually going to decrease the amount of crime. But that's important because American Progress finds in 2012 that when we decrease crime in an area, we inevitably lead to increasing greater economic opportunity in that same area because now people are willing to invest. This means that reintegration is going to be better improved in the negative world because we decrease crime, we stop the issue at its sources, and we actually increase economic opportunity for all people. Let's go to the contention, too, about accountability. He first talks about private corporations, and I want to make a really important point here. Realize that this is not inherent. There is no reason why you can't vote neg, and then we can start to publicize the algorithms. He doesn't give you any reason why the tool of predictive policing inherently must be a secret. But then, let's go on to the second reason he gives you about complexity, etc. Look to Gorshin in 2017, who explains that right now, some companies, like a lot of predictive policing companies, are moving towards publishing their algorithms. Not only that, but they're being covered by news sources who are willing to explain the algorithms to the public. This means the whole idea of it being opaque doesn't apply because right now the move is to publicize it. But let's go on to the idea of illegitimate power. Realize I would argue it's a good thing if we publish some algorithms. However, it's a really bad thing if we publish the predator algorithms so those people know exactly how we're going to catch them. This is really bad for structural oppression. But then let's go on to the third point he makes here about police efficacy and citizen distrust. Realize that you can look to Rand in 2016, who explains that we actually increase community relations when we make an area more safe. This is because people feel more safe, more able to talk to the police officers, which actually is going to increase citizen trust in the long term. Overall, because all of the problems he mentions are either problems that aren't intrinsic to predictive policing or things that predictive policing is actually helping to mitigate, I negate. And I'm open for cross-ex.
All right. Judges, are all you guys ready? Opponent?
Yeah.
All right. So with that, let's begin. So let's talk about your first contention about domestic violence. So
Yeah.
how does predictive policing predict domestic violence?
Sure. So essentially what happens in the status quo is that there's a survey that goes out to households in which there hasn't yet been a homicide yet relating to this, and essentially it's a series of questions that prompts the victims to answer, and then from that, the answers go into an algorithm to determine whether or not there is a high risk of a homicide occurring.
Okay, sure. So how effective has that been?
Sure. So what I explained in my case is that it's been really, really effective, as 1 in 3 of these victims have then gone to seek counseling or shelter or a protective order that actually stops this violence from happening in their house.
Okay, but how many of those victims have actually answered the survey?
Okay, so insofar as we're caring about structural oppression in this round, right, we are both advocating for minorities. Yeah. I don't think it makes much sense to say that, to talk about the size of the minority I'm advocating for. But what I'm telling you in this round is that there's 1/3 of the victims that actually are involved in this program actually go to that next step. That shows it was effective in curtailing the problem before it even happened.
Okay, so let's talk about curtailing the problem before it even happened.
Yeah.
So you're saying that there was no domestic abuse, and they stopped that domestic abuse before it happened?
Well, wait a minute. I don't have to say that I'm solving all of domestic abuse.
No, I'm not
But if
asking
I can
that.
show that I've stopped much of domestic homicide, I would say that's a pretty big benefit.
That's fine, but I'm asking you how you came to the conclusion that you stopped domestic abuse if it never happened.
Okay, so essentially we ask a series of questions on a survey that determine if there's already been slightly abusive tendencies in the household. But the real predictive policing aspect comes in where we predict there's about to be a homicide in that household, so we help the victims to seek safety. That is where we stop the domestic abuse incidents.
Okay, let's move on to your second contention where you talk about predators.
Yeah.
So clarify exactly what this contention is about.
Sure. So the predator's argument is essentially that there are some people who either stalk other individuals, who assault them, and that predictive policing is really effective at using geospatial analysis in order to predict where that person is going to go next and how we can best catch that
So
person.
how do they use geospatial analysis to predict individual behavior?
Yeah. So essentially what I tell you in the evidence I give you from Rosmo is that there are some very specific patterns that are specific to hunters. I'll give you one. For instance, there's a very large tendency that if you are a predator, you're going to hunt kind of sort of far away from your house, but not that far away, right? From that, they create a radius for you, and they actually monitor you as an individual before you do another crime.
Okay, that's fine. So let's move on to actually my side of the flow. I want to ask you about a few of these pieces of evidence. So first you read this UCLA evidence. So what was this a study of?
So this was a study of when we use predictive policing, and it analyzed predictive policing as a whole, and it came out that empirically,
what city was this a study of?
It's predictive policing as a whole.
As a whole? Okay. Finally, okay, so how do you make these algorithms less racist, I guess?
Sure. So what I would say is right now we're using black box methods. That comes from Ensign 2017. And second of all, what we do is we actually edit for the bias and make sure that doesn't occur in the next round.
Okay.
You're listening to the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland on 90.3 WCPN. That was Dev Peyrat cross-examining Allie Dettelbach. I'm Nick Castele from IdeaStream. I'm here with William Liu at Brecksville Broadview Heights High School. We've heard so far in this debate a lot of citations to studies, research that's been done at various universities. Could you explain for us here, how do you do the research necessary to be able to cite those sources live in a debate like that?
Well, essentially what you want to do is basically look up like one side of the topic. For example, predictive policing is just or predictive policing is unjust. Then you would look at some sources that would say one side of the opinion, and then you could use those as citations.
And do you basically have all these facts memorized when you're going into a debate?
No, I don't think very many people can do that, but what they usually do is they have like a block sheet, for example, of having like the citations already written down to use during round.
And so something people may not be aware of is that as a debater, you're actually preparing to argue either side of this, either affirmative or negative, right?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
So essentially you want to prepare both sides before the tournament or event you're going to, and make sure that you know both sides and either opinion.
And so when you're walking into a tournament, which happened on Saturday mornings, by the way, do you know which side you're going to be taking that day?
No, you, essentially what happens is right before the, right when the round is posted, they'll tell you what side you're going to be on and what side you're going to do. Unless it's like a higher or like finals round, they'll have basically have like a coin toss like in this event, and only sometimes do they have that.
And so this particular resolution, predictive policing is unjust. Have the debaters seen this case before?
No, I don't think so, but yeah, that's all.
But typically, in a debate, in a school year, you may see the same topic come up a few different times.
I don't think so. During this school year, we had all different topics throughout, ranging different time frames.
Could you give me some examples of what other things have you debated this year?
For example, like the elimination of nuclear arsenals, whether or not we should do it, or the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. Those are some examples of other topics.
So you're typically debating pretty heady questions, it sounds like. What's that like?
Well, like sometimes there's like things that are a bit like more obscure. Like for example, mostly everyone knows about nuclear arsenals, but not as much people know about fossil fuel subsidies. So it'd be a bit harder to research like those smaller topics.
And so do you typically, as you're researching a topic, develop a favorite side? And we may get back to that question in just a second as we return to the debate.
All right, so briefly off time, in this speech, I'm going to be going over the affirmative and then the negative. Are all my judges ready? My opponent? Yeah. All right, with that, I'll begin. So my opponent concedes the framework. So really in today's round, what you're looking to is reducing structural oppression, helping the least well off. So let's move on to my first contention about discrimination. Now, she just kind of gives you a lot of overviews, and she concedes the individual warranting here. So she's conceded, first of all, that analysts insert their bias into algorithms. Second, that data is fraudulent and it negatively impacts minorities. Third, that police officers have heightened awareness when they go into prediction areas. And finally, that police officers hamper the reintegration of former offenders into society. This is going to be really big in today's round. Now let's move on to those overviews that she does give you. First, she tells you that, well, the rest of the criminal justice system will just solve for these issues. But realize that you're forcing minority communities to go through that criminal justice system in the first place when they shouldn't have. So this is still harming the minority, even if they get off of their sentence. Further, she gives you this Ensign 17 card and tells you that, well, we just made algorithms less racist. That's not what Ensign does. What Ensign is doing is using an earn model to take weight for if a certain area is over-policed, it takes the weight of the amount of policing in that area and turns it down and makes it so all areas have the same weight of the amount of policing. So really, this just makes predictive algorithms ineffective because you're not predicting policing in certain places. All you're doing is equally distributing officers across the city. Then she just says that, well, it's better to have police officers with an algorithm than with their own biases. But realize that this resolution is not asking us about implementation. Instead, it's asking us if predictive policing itself is unjust. So you drop that. Now let's move on to my second contention, where I talk to you about accountability. Now, as an overview, she attacks by saying, well, we can just publicize these algorithms, but we can't publicize algorithms about predators. That's the issue here. If we publicize these algorithms, then they're ineffective because people will see the algorithms and just move crime. Or if we don't publicize these algorithms, they're inherently unjust because you're effectively silencing the voices of minorities. This is a double bind that my opponent has to choose in. And in her next speech, she's gonna have to choose one of the two. Now, she drops my first warrant completely, and this shows you that proprietary technology ensures that predictive technologies will never be released to the public. And also on my second warrant, she just says that, well, companies will just explain these machine learning algorithms. But that's not enough, because what this is telling you is that these companies don't even understand their own algorithms after the machine learning systems get to work. This is huge, flow that through. She also drops the accountability gap, so realize that we can't hold officers accountable for their actions in the negative world. And finally, and this is really important, she drops my entire third contention, which shows you that it's much harder for police officers to actually police when they have predictive policing. The two reasons I gave you were first that the algorithms are too complex and they don't understand them, and second, that crime is underreported. This is going to be really key when I move on to my opponent's side of the flow right now. Now, on that side of the flow, she first gives you this observation, but remember, all my warrants were intrinsic reasons why predictive policing is unjust, so this observation really doesn't weigh against my case. Now, on both of her contentions, these are both reliant on the idea that predictive algorithms can actually predict where crime is occurring. And she conceded my third contention, which shows you that they can't predict where crime is occurring. First of all, because officers don't know what they're doing when they go to a location where crime has been marked. And second of all, because it fails, because many crimes are underreported, specifically the crimes my opponent's talking about. So my opponent's failing to actually promote these things, to actually mitigate structural oppression in domestic violence and predatory situations. Then you also realize that she drops the empiric evidence that I gave you that shows you that only 1% of victims were actually predicted by predictive policing. This is huge because I'm showing you here that neither of these contentions can actually flow because you can't actually predict the victims. Now, furthermore, let's move on to my opponent's individual contentions. Her first contention is about domestic violence, but realize this is reliant on victims answering the surveys. Their abusers can easily stop them from answering the surveys, so there's really no impact here. And her second contention is about predators, but realize this requires blatant privacy violation and stalking of individuals, which ultimately creates a dystopian police state. So with that, I affirm.
You're listening to the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland on 90.3 WCPN. That was Dev Peyrat of University School arguing in the affirmative this resolution, predictive policing is unjust. I'm Nick Castele from IdeaStream. I'm here with William Liu, a freshman at Brecksville, Broadview Heights. I do want to take a moment to let our listeners at home know that typically this room is packed to the gills with high school debate teams. Today we have a much more reduced audience of a bit under 50 people, I believe, as a precaution against the spread of COVID-19. And our debaters each have their own individual lecterns, so they're not sharing microphones either. I think I was asking before, William, when you're preparing for a debate, as you're learning both sides of the issue, do you ever become tied to one side or the other and just feel much more convinced by either the affirmative or the negative?
Well, I don't think that happens really often, but sometimes when the sides are really one-sided, your opinion could get changed.
And do you ever feel like you have to get up there and make the best argument you can for something you just don't believe in?
Yeah, sometimes you really don't believe in like a certain side of the argument, but you have to argue it anyway.
Could you describe a little bit about what's that like? I mean, how do you still go out there and make your best case if in your heart you think this isn't right?
Well, you basically have to look at a point of view in which you just have to argue the argument itself, and you don't have to actually like believe in it. So you just have statistics and logical arguments of another side that you don't believe in.
Do you feel like you've learned anything from that process of sort of gaming out how different arguments might be made?
Yeah, you get to learn like the other side of an argument, or see how like other people see a certain side of the argument.
Now, I think I said before, often these debates happen on Saturday mornings. Could you describe what's that like for people who may not be familiar?
Well, sometimes it's like kind of hard to wake up because it's usually like at 6 or 7 in the morning, but eventually like 1 or 2 hours in, you usually wake up.
And these are usually like day-long events, right? You're spending your whole Saturday basically at these tournaments.
Yeah, and after the tournament, you're usually really tired and you don't really want to do anything after that.
Well, our debaters here are still going strong, and we will return to the debate right now.
All right, so the order of the speech is just going to be going down the affirmative case, and then I'll move on to the negative side, where I will give some key voting issues for the round, which will kind of include some of the answers he made to my case. Is everybody ready? Okay. Then let's begin on my opponent's contention 1 about discrimination. He makes one key concession here that takes this contention out on its face. Remember the UCLA study I give you at the top, which explains to you that actually, when we analyze empirical incidents of using predictive policing, we don't see more instances of profiling. We don't see more instances of racism. This means that whatever he tells you in his next speech, you cannot possibly vote for him off of this contention because I've already shown you that predictive policing is not what makes the difference. But then, let's go on. He says that we're forcing minorities through the system, and he says that all Ensign says is that we're taking the weight into account. But you don't even have to buy the Ensign evidence to still believe what I'm saying. Remember, I give you other evidence from Lindsay in 2018 that says that right now in the status quo, we have algorithms that are being edited right now to take out the bias. What this means is that everything he's going to tell you about the feedback loop and implicit bias is something we can edit. Remember back to what I tell you about the knife. Insofar as he can't prove it's a quality intrinsic to the knife, he can't prove it's unjust. And what I've shown you is this is actually something we can edit for. But even more crucially, I've shown you why this issue of discrimination is actually a reason why predictive policing can be helpful, can be just. He responds to the explanation and the weighing I give you by saying that we're not talking about implementation. But he misses the argument entirely. What the argument is that predictive policing cannot possibly be unjust if it is a tool that we're using to combat structural oppression. In this way, it has helped to minimize structural oppression for 2 key reasons. First, there's more police officers than there are algorithms. That means that necessarily my world is the world of far less biases, and he doesn't respond to that. Responding to it in his next speech would be too late. But secondly, realize that it's far easier to edit a machine than to edit a person's biases. That's why predictive policing is an objectively good tool that we can use in order to mitigate structural oppression, in order to make sure that we don't have as many biases, we don't have as much discrimination. With that, let's go on to the reintegration. I just want to make it clear that he drops one key argument that's really important here. Remember, in a world of predictive policing, we are decreasing crime. That means we increase economic opportunity, which is really, really important, because if you truly believe that we should help more marginalized communities, the best way to do it is set them up for long-term economic success that is sustainable. But let's go on to the contention 2 about accountability. My opponent says that I'm in a double bind because if we publicize the algorithm, it becomes ineffective. But he's not really responding to the argument I'm making. I'm saying that sure, in the status quo, we have some algorithms published. That is already evidence I give you from Gershon in 2017. However, I'm saying it's good that we don't have all of them published, like he would say, because, for instance, we don't want predators to know how we find them to make that algorithm less effective. In that way, it is clear that we can strike a balance. This isn't a contradiction at all. But then let's go to the contention 3, which I actually do respond to, the idea of decreasing police efficiency. Remember, I tell you that we can actually increase community relations because communities feel more safe when we have predictive policing, which uniquely increases communication between them. He's saying that it makes it harder to police, but he doesn't respond to the argument, which clean concedes that it's actually easier for police to do their jobs if we have a tightened community relationships, which we inevitably do if we have more safety and more trust among those communities. That means that the algorithm of predictive policing is a tool that can be used to do just things because it increases community relations, making it easier for police to do their jobs. But let's go on to my case. He responds to my observation about essentially what I give you about the knife by saying that all of the benefits he gives you in his case are intrinsic. But he drops some key arguments on his side that would indicate it's not intrinsic. Remember the evidence I give you from UCLA. Remember the evidence I give you to show that some companies are publicizing. At this point, he has to stand up here and prove to you that in his next speech, every single element that he talks about is intrinsically bad to predictive policing, and he's already made the concessions to prove that's not true. With that, let's go to the first key voting issue in this round, which is going to be the idea of domestic violence. My opponent says that it simply relies on the fact that prediction is effective. But he doesn't respond to the turn I give you on his side, which explains that we increase community relations, making it uniquely more effective. If people feel safer, they'll feel more comfortable talking to the police, they'll feel more comfortable reporting their instances, and that is logic he hasn't responded to. Then he also says that only 1% has been predictive. But remember, we're both advocating for minorities here. That's why we're trying to minimize structural oppression. It doesn't make sense for him to say that, that my minority is too small. And then, let's go on to the contention 2, where he simply says this is a privacy violation. And this is the second key voting issue of the idea of predators. But this is a really problematic, because if my opponent is suggesting that we should respect the privacy of predators, I would say that is absolutely untrue. We should violate their privacy in order to stop them from being sexually abusive. And that is what I tell you, is that predictive policing is a vital tool in combating structural oppression because it uses geospatial analysis in order to predict where predators are going to go, and it stopped them. Remember the example I give you of Vancouver, for instance, where girls were assaulted in a wooded area and traditional policing was not enough to solve it. It was only once we used the tool of predictive policing that we could solve it. At this point, I have given you 2 clean reasons why, under the framework of structural oppression, you are voting from my side. But let me give you a third. The third key voting issue, and where you sign your ballot for the negative, is on the idea of bias. Remember the key weighing I provide for you that he never really responds to, which is that insofar as predictive policing is a tool that uniquely decreases the amount of biases we have. From 40,000 different police officers to one algorithm, or a couple algorithms, that means there are less biases on face. That means if you're voting on the issues of racism, if you're voting on the issues of minorities, you're automatically voting negative. But the second reason I give you is because it is far easier to edit an algorithm, to edit a machine, than to edit a person. And that is the crux of the negative argumentation. I show you in this round that predictive policing is a tool that we can actually use to be just, to minimize structural oppression by just decreasing the amount of biases on net. So for these reasons, and the many more reasons I give you on the other side of the round, I urge you to decrease structural oppression by negating.
This is the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland on 90.3 WCPN. You were just listening to Allie Dettelbach deliver the negative argument. We will soon hear from Dev Peyrat, a sophomore at University School. They're debating the resolution, Predictive Policing is Unjust. I'm Nick Castele from IdeaStream. I'm here with William Liu at Brecksville Broadview Heights High School. Could you explain, when you get to the later part of the debate here, you've done your cross-examinations, you've delivered some speeches. What are you trying to do at the end to bring things home and make your point?
So essentially, you want to wrap things up by showing on what points you definitely won, on what points your opponent didn't address, and that certain points that flowed through the round basically, and that's how you want to establish your key voting issues.
Well, who gets to determine the terms of the frame of the debate, which points you're trying to make and which points you won or lost? Isn't that up to the judges?
Well, I mean, certainly on the flow on which you take notes of your opponent's case, you can see whether or not they addressed your actual arguments or whether or not they addressed your attacks on their case. You can see that on your notes.
So you can see that in your notes. And when you say flow, could you describe what that means for people who aren't familiar?
That's basically just a fancier term for saying debate notes, or basically you take notes on your side and you take notes on your opponent's side.
And we will now return to the debate.
Okay, so in this speech, I'm just going to be giving you guys key voting issues. Judges, are all of you ready? Opponent? All right, with that, I'll begin. So in today's debate, what you realize is that the negative is presenting you a step towards dystopia, whereas the affirmative is presenting you a step and a block towards that dystopia. And realize that, and the second thing you have to realize in today's debate is that just policies must first of all be transparent, and second of all, non-discriminatory. And predictive policing algorithms fail to do both. First, being non-discriminatory. This idea, that's my first key voting issue. This idea that predictive policing is making a bad situation worse. Now, realize that my opponent conceded my entire third contention, where I explained to you how predictive policing algorithms are actually extremely ineffective. And when I cross-applied this to her case, she just made these 2 small responses. The first was that, she says that, my minority is not, I'm saying that her minority is too small. What I told you is that that impact doesn't occur at all, because remember, on her first contention, it's completely reliant on victims actually filling out whatever survey. That doesn't happen. And then on her second contention, she tries to respond by saying, well, I'm telling you to respect the privacy of predators. But remember, I already told you that predictive policing is ineffective at actually predicting people. Remember the 1% statistic. It fails at actually predicting 1% of homicide victims. So realize that we're not monitoring predators. We're not invading the privacy of predators. We're invading the privacy of innocent people. Furthermore, realize that on my first contention, she completely drops all 4 of my individual warrants and just gives you a bunch of overviews. So let's talk about those overviews. The first one, the first big overview she gives you is that, well, we can just edit machines, not people. But the only actual way she gave you to edit the machine is to make the crime statistics flat, to spread police out evenly. So then that's not predictive policing, and there's no benefit for it, and it's completely ineffective. The other overview she gives you is, well, less crime is good because it'll mend relationships with minority communities and police. But realize that less crime comes at the cost of discrimination. She conceded the impact I gave you from LUM 16 that told you that there was 200 times more drug arrests due to predictive policing. That's huge. So let me move on to my second key voting issue, and the biggest issue in today's round, which is this idea of transparency and how predictive policing fails to be transparent. Now realize that if you buy my opponent's case, you're buying that we're putting tape over the mouths of minorities. We are stopping from minorities from speaking up and actually because of this lack of transparency. So let's talk about the entire contention. First, she just says there's no double bind because, well, we can strike a balance between just not publicizing the ones about predators and just publicizing everything else. But if we publicize everything else, realize that it becomes completely ineffective because people will just move crime. And further, even if you buy that we just keep the certain algorithms private, it's still unjust because the public doesn't know how that algorithm works. And so realize that there's an accountability gap where officers avoid culpability and checks on their behavior and are allowed to continue abusing minorities. Remember, this is the biggest impact in today's round, and the one that ultimately wins me it, because realize that she almost completely concedes this idea of transparency. So with that, I affirm. I'm not gonna, you want to just fist bump?
You've been listening to the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland on 90.3 WCPN. For those of you who couldn't see this at home, they ended that debate with a fist bump and not a handshake. And now we'll give it over to Dan Moulthrop, who will close out this segment here.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to stand off the stage. Usually I stand up there with you, but given what's going on, you guys stand up. Get back there. Everybody give them a round of applause again, please. Great debate. So there was some standing ovations there. I just want to note that for both of you. So while the judges are finishing tallying their results, we're going to have just an informal conversation. Do either of you have like political or legal aspirations?
I definitely do.
Really? What's
Yeah.
that about, Allie?
I
Allie Dettelbach.
yeah, I definitely want to be a lawyer and then maybe one day go into politics.
Really? Really? How interesting. What a shocker there. Do you want to mention who your dad is, or?
Oh, my Steve over there.
Yeah. Erstwhile candidate. Yeah. Dev, what about you?
No.
No?
I've always really loved like creative writing, and that's kind of like something that I've been pursuing like my whole life. So, or not my whole life, since like second grade, but yeah.
Interesting. Are we ready? Are we ready for the announcements? We are almost ready for the announcements. Well, as we prepare and before we announce the winners, can we give our competitors one more round of applause? You both did such a great job. And now I'd like to invite our good friend Tom Lucchesi of BakerHostetler to join me up in front here, or I'll walk over this way. And Tom, are we starting with the runner-up, or are we starting with the? It's either. Well, I know there's only two. It's really not very confusing after that moment. But go ahead, Tom. Who is our winner?
And the winner is, well, first of all, you both did a great job. So another round of applause for both of our competitors. And by decision of the judges, the winner is Allie Dettelbach.
Congratulations. And a round of applause, too, for Dev Peyrat, our runner-up, our second place. And congratulations to Hawken School and to University School. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being a part of our forum today. This has been a very special forum. I actually have a script I just realized that I'm supposed to mention and perhaps read. But this has been a very special forum. And again, in the midst of this coronavirus challenge, I'm really delighted that we were able to provide a forum, provide a platform for our debaters. I do want to mention, finally, as well, sorry, I'm just spreading this all over the place, but our High School Debate Championship is sponsored by BakerHostetler in memory of Patrick J. Jordan. We have many of Patrick's BakerHostetler colleagues with us today, and we're grateful for their continued support of this debate. And as you know, we're intent on keeping the community connected, even as we battle COVID-19, and we received our first Continue the Conversation contribution earlier this week from Mark Ross. He's managing partner at PwC here in Cleveland, also on our board, and that contribution is helping us continue to convene our community for online conversations during this challenging time. It's important that we all stay connected. And with his gift, Mark is hoping to inspire other City Club members and friends to step up and make similar contributions to support our mission. From a business perspective, of course, PwC is a professional services firm equally committed to supporting the communities in which they do business. I want to thank our students who are here from local high schools, their teachers and others, and the families of our students. Student participation City Club forums are made possible by contributions from the Char and Chuck Fowler Family Foundation and the William M. Weiss Foundation, with additional support from other sponsors listed in our program. That closes our 2020 High School Debate Championship. Thank you, debaters. Thank you, members and friends of the City Club, with special thanks to our members who make our work possible. You can support our mission online at cityclub.org. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Stay healthy, be kind, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You were great.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.